Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the And God Said podcast. I'm Reverend Kimberly Constant. I'm your host, and this podcast is offered in conjunction with a 9-month Bible study I teach called Cover to Cover, in which we read through the Bible all the way from Genesis to Revelation, studying each book on its own and then trying to put together the big picture, the big themes. What is God trying to teach us in Scripture? So today we are going to dive into one of what I think are the most interesting books in Scripture, one that bears spending a little bit of time in. We're going to slow it down again for the next couple of lectures and dive somewhat deep into the heart of the book of Joshua. This is going to be a new genre that we haven't seen yet in the Bible, and it also brings up just a lot of difficult things to wrestle with. The elements that you typically hear people worry about when it comes to the Old Testament. Why does God seem so angry, so punishing? Why is there so much violence? Why is God commanding people to murder these Canaanites? There's a lot of things to talk about here. So we are going to dive into it today. This lecture will set the scene for us. So I'm calling it Courage, Dear Heart, which is a quote from the Narnia series. And we're looking at setting the scene for the book of Joshua. So if you're in the Cover to Cover Bible study, this will prepare you for the readings that you're going to do in Joshua. And if you aren't in that study and you're just following along with the podcast, it's going to give you an overview of just the big basics behind this book. So if we're trying to situate ourselves within history, we're still in that kind of murky period where certain scholars are going to argue for an earlier date and other scholars are going to argue for a later date. I tend to agree with the people with the bit of the later date around 1250 BC. So sometime between 1400 and 1250. As we remember what we covered in Exodus, they had wandered in the desert after being rescued by God from Egypt, and they spent about a year at the foot, of Mount Sinai, where God formed them into a nation. They then wandered in the desert for 40 years because of their unfaithfulness. It should not have been quite such a long journey to get to the promised land, but it was. They were unfaithful and they had a lot of things go wrong in that journey. And so the punishment was that generation would not get to enter into the land. And when we left off with the Pentateuch, with the final words of Deuteronomy, Moses had just died, and the last of that generation that was punished had passed away. And so now it was time to finally get to go into the land. And so we pick up the story with Joshua, who has been tapped to be the next leader of God's people. So if you're able to see this presentation, I've got a map here. If not, you can always Google it later. Just Google a map of the Exodus from Egypt, and you can pull up kind of what it looked like. It's not a straightforward path. Obviously, since they wandered, they kind of went all around, sometimes doubling back on themselves before they finally get to where they are at the end of the Pentateuch, at the end of those first 5 books of the Bible, which is just to the east of the land of Canaan. So they're just across the Jordan River from Jericho, and they're stationed there, kind of ready for their final preparations. But before we get into Joshua, we are entering into a new category of scriptural books. So the Pentateuch was the first 5 books. They can be organized as such because they were, largely contributed to by Moses, written around the same time period, similar voices contributing to the editorial process, and it told the larger story of how Israel came to be, its origins. It's its origin story, as well as our origin story as human beings. Now we're going to look at the history of Israel. So we've got them, they're a nation now, and so we're looking at what are called the historical books. This is the life of Israel as they both rise and fall to their duty of being God's people. So we have Joshua, which is what we'll look at in the next few lectures. We have Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So we are going to cover a large time period in these historical books. We're going to go all the way from their entering into the promised land to their exile from that land to the remnant that returns. So these books, as I said, tell the story of the nation of Israel. The primary focus of these books is on the nation as a whole, or its leadership. We're really a big picture here. We don't get very many glimpses of just individual stories unless it pertains to Israel as a whole. So, for instance, we'll get to know King David quite well because he becomes the king. There's a few exceptions to this, including the entirety of the book of Ruth, which is one of my favorites. And we also get the stories of the prophets of Elijah and Elisha, but they are leaders, so that makes sense. There's a few little interpolations of different individuals in these books, but for the most part, we're either looking at leaders or just the nation as a whole. And the theology that's going to emerge from these books needs some nuance. It can be too simplistic if we take it at face value. We've already learned from Deuteronomy that obedience to the covenant is going to result in blessings for the nation, and Moses very clearly delineated what those blessings would be. Disobedience to the covenant would result in removal of those blessings and punishment. That is the nation as a whole. That is the nation and the king as the kings that will come, the leadership, I guess we should say for now, as they will uphold the covenant. That formula does not translate to the life of an individual person. And so we will have to kind of pause that until we get to the wisdom literature where we're going to dive into kind of the issues with such a simple formula. But just know that in your head as you're studying these books, as you're becoming familiar with them, as you hear me talk about them in the next few weeks, that formula, obedience equals blessing, disobedience equals removal of blessing, is to Israel as a whole as they follow or don't follow the will of God. It is not something that drills down to an individual level. We're going to see the continued use by God of just normal people. He uses faithful, yes, but not perfect human beings to accomplish his purposes. We've also seen God do some amazing miracles on his own, but we've noticed so far as we've read that he does both. He works these inspiring miracles, parting the Red Sea, and then he works through the voices and hands and feet of other people. And so we'll continue to see that as we look at these books. We're going to get an important part of theology is that God cares for all people. God doesn't just care about the Israelites. Yes, they are his chosen people, but chosen for a missional purpose. God formed them into a nation to enable them to be his hands and feet and voices, to enable them to withstand the presence of God living amongst them so that they could make God known to the rest of the world. The idea is that more and more people would come to know God. And so we're going to start to see foreigners become part of God's family. He already in the law had a lot of ordinances that dealt with foreigners, how to treat them, to incorporate them into the community. And we're going to see that come to pass even just in Joshua as we begin. And then we're going to see the continued understanding of trusting in God in that which is, for most part unseen, versus trusting in our circumstances or our emotions, the things that we can see and feel. That will be a theme that will thread all the way through the historical books. And then for those of us who are Christians, who are believers in Jesus Christ, or who have knowledge of the New Testament, that provides another lens with which to view these historical books. Again, that simplistic obedience faithfulness formula through Jesus is going to be tied to the New Testament covenant, and that is a spiritual covenant. So notice, in these Old Testament covenants, there's physical reward, there's land, there's physical fruitfulness. They're going to have lots of children if things are going well and they're following the covenant. In Jesus' time in the New Testament, we have a spiritual covenant. So we continue to be fruitful, but it's a spiritual fruitfulness. We will inherit a kingdom, but it's a spiritual kingdom. So there's an eternal reward. There's hope and inheritance tied to a kingdom that has no end. Jesus' sacrifice replaces the sacrificial system. We've talked about that as we've looked at the book of Leviticus. Jesus renders us pure in the sight of God, so we don't have to worry about clean versus unclean. Again, something we looked at in Leviticus. Jesus frees us to go forth and serve God fully and to have God living within us. We are now the tabernacles. And so Jesus Christ is enthroned as Lord of all. He fulfills the laws of the Mosaic covenant, and now we follow Jesus. So just remember that. This is, as we read these historical books, there's a lot that does not apply to us. A lot of theology that has been developed because of what Jesus Christ taught us. This is that idea of progressive revelation. So there's going to be things for us to wrestle with here, and some of it is because these Israelites just didn't know all there was to know about God yet. There was so much more to be revealed through Jesus. And then a word about this land that they're going into, the promised land or the land of Canaan. It's helpful to understand its geography as we envision sort of the infiltration and battles being fought in this land. It largely consisted of mountains and valleys, although there are also desert regions as well. Because of its topography, it's better suited for many small settlements or cities rather than one large city center where millions of people live and then there's a few people scattered. This is a land where there's going to be pockets of people everywhere and not necessarily one ginormous city. The Canaanites, after Israel becomes dominant, after they push most of them out of the land, they are going to migrate to what is now Lebanon, and they will become known as the Phoenicians. So you might have heard that of the Phoenicians in your history lessons in school, and that's what happens to the Canaanites. And the Canaanites that we are going to encounter in Joshua and in the book of Judges are very wicked. There's some verses about this in Kings about their wickedness in 2 Kings 16:3 and in 2 Kings 17:15 through 17 that talk about all the terrible things that they were doing. They were engaged in human sacrifice, often the firstborn sons, sometimes even when they were infants, sometimes older. They engaged in the process of divination, which is taking the organs from an animal and kind of analyzing the lines in the organs and using that as guidance. They were engaged in prostitution as temple worship, as a form of fertility ritual. They were doing all kinds of evil, wicked things, and they were, God would say, perverting the land. Part of this entrance into Canaan is not just on behalf of Israel, but it's to rescue the land as well from the defilement that it has endured under Canaan, rule. All right, so now let's turn to the book of Joshua itself. This is a story of courage and conquest. As far as authorship and dating go, it is believed that Joshua probably wrote or dictated most of this material himself. Certainly, he would have had help from scribes, and scribes would have finished the book because it ends with an account of Joshua's death and burial. Obviously, he couldn't write that himself. So there is some editorial insertions here. You'll see that. You'll see reference as you read to like the book of Jasher, for instance, books that we don't have anymore, that don't exist, that are in our biblical canon. You'll see reference to them to say, and by the way, what we're talking about, that's still going on to this day. So here and there, you're going to see indications of timing and other people contributing. But for the most part, it's believed this story is being retold by Joshua. And its dating, it was probably begun before even the reign of King David, so relatively close to the events as they happened. Why do I say this? Well, in Joshua 6:25, it is said that Rahab is still living. They took her and she lived with the Israelites, and she still lives with the Israelites to this day. So that indicates that the book was created not long after the events if Rahab is still alive. But again, portions are inserted later, editorial comments, and then, of course, the details about Joshua's death. So the genre of Joshua is crucial to understanding how we go about interpreting this book. And it's something that's called conquest literature. We have not seen it yet in the Bible, but it was very prominent in the ancient Near East. Everybody would have been familiar with this type of literature, and most of the big nations, Egypt for one, would have used this type of literature. It is a genre of hyperbole, intentionally so. So, what is hyperbole? It's exaggerated statements or claims that are not meant to be taken literally. They're not lies, they're just exaggerations. So, my example for you, I'm a Houston Astros fan. They recently just won the first round of postseason against the Twins. And so I might say with excitement, the Astros annihilated the Twins and they're moving on in the playoffs. So you would know, because you would know that verbiage, that I'm not saying that the Astros murdered the Twins. That's not the annihilation I'm talking about. I'm not even necessarily saying that they won every single game that they played, because they didn't. I'm just saying at the end of the day, they annihilated the Twins and they are moving on. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize the soundness of the final victory, my excitement over the victory. It's not meant to be literal. This is true of Joshua too. There is truth in everything that we're going to read in Joshua, but we have to interpret the truth with this kind of genre in mind. It's hyperbole, it's exaggeration, it's looking at the end of the story and not necessarily the small things in the middle. So, we might have lost a battle, but we won the war. It's that kind of focus. Another example might be I have two boys, Carson and Palmer. And I might say to them, Carson and Palmer, I've told you to clean your rooms 1,000 times. Now, maybe at this point, they're both into their late teens. Maybe it's close to 1,000 times, but probably not 1,000 times. Clearly, I'm exaggerating for effect. I've told them to clean their rooms. There's truth in this statement. Probably if I was making that statement, I'm annoyed. Like, I've told you to clean it 1,000 times. Can you please just bring all the dishes that I'm missing to the kitchen so I can wash them? So it's not an exaggeration meant to mislead. It's not meant to intentionally lie. It's meant to add emotion and feeling and say so much more in that sentence than just the mere words themselves. So understanding this genre and understanding what is going on is going to help us reconcile some of the difficult material. Not all. There's still going to be difficulty as you read. There's a lot of violence in this book. But it will also help us make sense of some of the inconsistencies, because we're going to see statements in Joshua that differ from the statements made in the book of Judges, which is the book that comes next. Even Joshua himself kind of seems to contradict himself. And this is why, again, it's this conquest literature. So I'll try to point them out when they are important to moving the story forward. As with all biblical interpretation, trying to understand this book, we have to make decisions with the knowledge we have available. These are ancient stories. It's written in ancient languages that are no longer spoken anymore. There's so much interpretive decisions that go into even just giving it to us in the language that we read it today. And then we have to make decisions. How do we apply this then to our lives? And here in the book of Joshua, it gets tricky because of this conquest literature, because of some of the violence, because of what is going on. It's a very specific command that God's giving, not meant for all time and all people. So keep that in mind as you look at this book, and we'll wrestle with it as we continue our reading. So Joshua is structured geographically. There's a progression of events but it's not necessarily chronological. It's more geographical. Like, here's this piece of land, and then we're going into this piece of land. And so there's some instances where it's like almost they're doubling back on each other because, again, it's not chronologically focused, it's geographically focused. So the first 12 chapters deal with the possession and conquest of the land. The first 5 chapters are about preparing to enter into the land. So half of that material almost is just preparation. And then the rest of it is what happens when they go in. And Joshua, there's not detail of every single battle that was fought. There's just kind of highlights, the important ones, the battles that reveal something about God, the battles that reveal something about the people, or that explain why things are the way they are. So we're not going to see every single skirmish that happens. It's kind of condensed into a quicker timeline with, again, the ultimate focus being on the fact that, yes, eventually Israel does inhabit the entirety of the land. But it takes a little longer than what we would understand if we read Joshua at face value. Then we have a huge section, which we are not going to read if you're in my Bible study, of dividing the land. It's very technical and detailed and just difficult to read. It's dry. There's a little bit of story in there, but not much. Most of it's just like, and this person got this land, and then this person got this land, and oh, here was an exception. So we skip that over, and I will cover and lecture briefly, but it's just real dry material. So that's chapters 13 through 21. And then the final section is sort of dealing with implications of possession. Once they are settled in the land, what happens? And that's chapters 22 through 24. So Joshua's conquest begins, as I said, they're just to the east of the Jordan River, just north of the Dead Sea, and they're going to cross over at a city called Jericho. That's where the first battle is going to take place, and we're going to see a lot of that in that central area of Canaan. And then there's also a southern campaign and a northern campaign. And again, as I said, we're seeing it organized geographically, not chronologically, because a lot of these battles overlap each other as well. First of all, we're not going to see every battle that happens. Secondly, there's multiple campaigns going on at the same time. It's not all the army all together, all fighting in every single place. Certainly that's the case with Jericho, the first one, and then they kind of split off. And we're actually going to see, even into the book of Judges, that there's still skirmishes happening in different pockets of the land until they finally conquer it once and for all. So there's a question about infiltrating the land that we talked about when we looked at Exodus. And we talked about the different theories for when the Exodus happened. And that very much connects to Joshua because, we're dealing with the same generation. And then that generation's children who finally get to go into the land. Again, because of the nature of conquest literature, Joshua depicts these battles as quick. It's like, it feels like it's over in an instant. And it seems like all the armies together. And as I said, there were multiple campaigns, multiple different fronts. Everything is happening at the same time. And then we're going to read in Judges that Israelites did not actually subdue all the Canaanites in the time of Joshua, that they're still going to have battles with this group. So the Judges makes it seem like it took a lot more time than the book of Joshua makes it seem like. So why are these accounts conflicting? Well, the language is hard to translate. They use the words all and every. All the land was possessed. Everybody was subdued. And yes, eventually that is true. But it does seem that took some time. By the time of the final, draft of this book of Joshua, yes, Israel had fully inhabited the land and driven out or murdered all the Canaanites that were living there. But the events take longer than it seems. Archaeological evidence supports this. It both supports these decisive battles and also supports a longer time period for them, if that makes sense. So there's been excavations at Bethel, at Lachish, and at Hazor, and these all indicate significant damage. There's a layer where it's like, yeah, the city was completely wiped out all at once. Jericho is the same thing. In fact, Jericho, there's just really nothing left from that time period, which makes sense. That's what the Bible story tells us, is that there was nothing left standing. And so there really isn't much archaeological evidence to dig up because it was destroyed. But we also know, as I said, that because of the topography of the land, because of the nature of these skirmishes, it took longer. It wasn't like all of Israel moving as one giant organism. They're splitting off. They're fighting in different places, and they're kind of each going off to their own inheritance and to their own pocket of land as tribes, and then still having to deal with some of the Canaanite people once they get there. So what themes are we going to find in Joshua? Well, first, there's definite strong comparison between Joshua and Moses. Joshua is going to be depicted as like a second Moses. And so we talked about Moses being a type in the Bible being something that points forward to Jesus, to ideal leadership. So Joshua is going to do the same. He's going to point us forward to ideal human leadership. King David, for instance, one of their most revered leaders. And of course, he's going to point us forward to the ultimate King, Jesus. Joshua highlights God's sovereignty. We've seen that. They really understand that well in the Old Testament. They have a big sense of wonder and awe and understanding who God is. And we'll see this sovereignty play out in Joshua, especially via his administration of justice. So there's a lot of conquest and battles and violence. God is meting out justice and he is handing down punishments. But we're also going to see grace here. And I love to point out where grace shows up in the Old Testament, because sometimes it feels like that's something that's a New Testament concept, but it isn't. And so we're going to learn about the stories of Rahab and the Gibeonites, which detail God's grace and salvation. This book is going to continue to reveal what it means to be God's chosen people. And there is some hard things that God's going to ask of the people. It's not all butterflies and rainbows. Yes, they get to have God living amongst them. Yes, they're God's chosen people. There's so much benefit clearly to being the people of God. They're going to be protected. They're going to be fruitful if they can obey the covenant. But they're also going to be called to do some very difficult things. They're called to be the hands and feet and voices of God, both in administering grace and sometimes in administering God's judgment. It's very specific. It's very clear when God wants them to do that. It's not for all times and all places, but God is going to ask them to be the arbiters of his justice in some instances. Now, interestingly, in Jewish scripture, Joshua is included with their books of prophets. So they don't really put the book with the history, they put it with the prophetic messages. And that is true. There is elements of prophecy in Joshua. It contains lessons of hope. It certainly has instruction for future generation and really does point us forward to what's going to happen next for Israel. So continued theology of Joshua, we're going to see God keep his promises in a big way. As we've seen, this has been a long journey for the people of God. God made promises to Abraham a long time ago, to Isaac, to Jacob, and even to Moses because of God's goodness, because God is a God of grace. And we're going to see these promises come to fruition. So one of those is land. Land is fundamental to the covenant. It is one of the covenant rewards. And so it's one of God's promises that will be fulfilled in Joshua. And rest, both for the land and the people. We're going to see a season of rest. That idea of Sabbath, which is so important and so threaded through the law of God. And then we're going to see covenant renewal. Something that's going to happen again in the Old Testament, but we're going to see it twice here in Joshua. This is reminding us of the continual choice that is set before the people, that it's a choice that each generation has to own for itself, that each person has to own for him or herself. You have to choose in the Old Testament and in our times whether or not you are going to follow God. And God is very clearly going to delineate the terms of that choice. Here's what's going to happen if you obey me. Here's what will happen if you disobey me. You know this, and you're going to make your choice anyway. So if you choose to follow God in this book of Joshua, you know what you're getting yourself into. The same will be true for us in the New Testament as well. So what to look for as you're reading. Notice the repeated comparison between Joshua and Moses. Sometimes it's very explicit, even the similar language that will be used. Sometimes it's more implicit, things to look, between the lines that they're saying. Both are great leaders. Both are very faithful. Both are going to part waters. And so you want to ask, how is Joshua operating in a similar way to Moses? And then what differences, if any, do you notice? Look at the maturation process of Joshua. Does it look similar to Moses? Does he undergo one at all? Or does he seem to just have it right all the time? Does he make any mistakes in his leadership? That kind of thing. Then I want you to notice the repeated contrast going on as well between the Israelites and the Canaanites. Remember, Canaanites, wicked, wicked people. Israelites, very imperfect people, but they are God's people. So the Israelites, they're smaller in number and stature than the people living in Canaan, but they're God's faithful. And so we're going to see them conquer because of that faith. The Canaanites, they're larger in number and stature. They've been in the land for a while. They have all the advantage, but they're wicked and they have been defiling the land. And God will enable them to be conquered. There's going to be exceptions, however. Rahab and the Gibeonites are Canaanites that end up being welcomed into the fold of Israel, and Achan is an Israelite who is punished and driven out of the fold of Israel. So let's talk about why God might make exceptions and what this teaches us about God. And then I want you to pay attention to some of the conquests themselves. Notice when God intervenes and when he is a little more subtler in his participation. Sometimes it's like direct intervention, and sometimes God is going to work through the people. Sometimes there's going to be these huge miracles associated with a battle, and sometimes it's just simply going to be God giving them strength to get through the day. So notice that. When do the people have to kind of fight more conventionally, and when does God just intervene and they really don't seem to have to do very much at all? And then look for the administration of justice. This isn't going to be hard because it's all the way through Joshua. But notice who is God meting out justice towards? What is happening in that instance? How is that justice being administered? Is God doing it all himself, or is he calling upon the Israelites to take part in administering the punishment? And why might that be? All right, so that brings us to the end of setting the scene for your study of the book of Joshua.